Hi, good morning everyone. In our industry, capital follows opportunity. So the fact that we have so many people here today means private credit is shaping up to be a really significant opportunity, clearly. 20 years back, global conversations around India were focused on capital markets and public equity. A decade back, they were focused on more private equity. Today, a lot of global conversations are focused on private credit. And that really shows that it's a very, very strongly emerging asset class. At Brookfield, similar to any global fund, every investment competes from a global pool of capital, which means when we go in front of IC, we get three basic questions. Why India private credit today? What's different about India credit compared to the rest of the world? And what are your key concerns? So let's start with why India private credit today. The Indian private credit markets more than doubled in size in the last decade or 5 years. Now these numbers are actually impressive till you put them in the context of the global peers. The US market is measured in trillions of dollars. Asia, which is 40% of the global GDP, the Asian private credit market is only 10% of the global market. So Asia itself is actually disproportionate to what the weight it carries in the GDP. India in turn is a small fraction of this today at 25 billion. So if the private credit was a family, the US private credit is actually the eldest sibling which is being settled and employed for the last 20 years. The Indian market is really a teenage which just got its first credit card. But that's why it's also such a big opportunity going ahead, because it can provide you multi-decadal growth from here. The Indian economy today, one of the fastest growing in the world. We have an amazing domestic consumption story. And then if you think of the sectors that we are all investing in today as an economy, right? Real estate, infrastructure, logistics, digital transformation, data centers, all of these need a significant amount of capital, but more importantly, they also need flexible capital. And banks are increasingly pulling back. They are being more conservative. It reflects in better NPAs than where they were a decade back. But then banks were not meant to be providing flexible capital. And that's precisely the gap that private credit is supposed to be fulfilling. The other point I would make is 5 years back, private credit was more about distress credit, right? So you were the lender of last resort. Today, healthy operating businesses are taking on private credit because they are providing bespoke capital structure to the situation. And that's what is increasingly differentiating private credit today, and that's what gives it a growth path from here. Promoters are taking private credit because it's fast, because it's flexible, it suits their particular situation, right? And also for the quality of the partner, because a private credit doesn't act simply like a lender, it also adds value to you as a partner. And that's what's going to increasingly shape the choice for the private credit lender going ahead. Let's talk a little bit about what makes India different. It has characteristics unlike pretty much anywhere else in the world for private credit. First and most important, real estate is the largest segment last year for private credit. 40% of private credit went into real estate. Now, real estate in India is a very peculiar animal. Right? One, as a private credit lender, you're never really sure if there's financial closure in the project, because most of the cost is being financed by pre-sales, in residential especially, right? And which you have no visibility over. Two, when you do these projects and financings, there is always a risk that you're carrying as a lender that in year 3 there will be an approval which you never heard of, but now it's required, and without that the project is stalled. And you might have an 80-page title diligence report, but that doesn't stop the previous owner's uncle from filing a legal claim on the title. And this is all part and parcel of real estate lending in the country. Now that's not to say it's not an attractive segment. It's a segment that needs capital. It needs capital at scale, and it provides you great risk-adjusted return. But what we do need to collectively think of as a private credit industry is making sure that we do it right this time. In the last cycle, we all heard stories over the last decade of banks and NBFC books on real estate, which were absolutely hammered on their real estate book. And it's very, very important that as an industry, we get it right this time, and this time is different from a lending perspective. The second more unique characteristic here is that promoter finance is the next largest segment after real estate credit. Now when I do promoter finance in, let's say, Australia, because I cover Asia for Brookfield, right, we underwrite the business, we underwrite the cash flow, we underwrite the management. When we do promoter financing in India, we finance the promoter, we finance the entire promoter holdco to understand what is he doing and where are his problems, and we also have to underwrite the entire promoter's family tree to understand the family dynamics. It's a very, very different way of approaching the market. And once the transaction is done, right, you are primarily the lender, you are then the strategic advisor for the business, because you need to make sure that he doesn't go and mess it up because you need to get paid. And you are the unofficial family counselor. When the promoter and his brother or the promoter and his son have a problem, you are the counselor, you provide the counseling for free. So it's a very, very different approach to dealing with counterparties here. But the point I would make is, again, it's a segment which is critical, it needs scale, it needs to be financed because banks can only do so much of this. But local knowledge, both of balance sheets and promoter, is such a huge competitive advantage in this market. It's not a market where you can fly in, fly out and do a private credit transaction. Lastly, talking about what are key concerns. From the perspective of a global manager, India is increasingly difficult to ignore. We have to be realistic about the concerns though. First, I would say scale. Right? When you are investing out of multi-billion-dollar funds, the deployment size matters. LPs don't want to pay us management fees for doing 6 months of diligence on a $40 million transaction. And then when you look at the market over the last 5 years and do a Venn diagram of the target returns and transactions above $100 million in size, it's actually still a very small limited pool of transactions, which is very, very competitive. Two, from a foreign investor perspective, less of an issue, of course, for all the domestic capital going to private credit. The USD returns are significantly challenged because of the hedging costs involved. And the moment you try and lend at higher denomination, so INR, let's say 18 to early 20 IRRs, to cover up for your hedging cost, you're dealing with a very, very different risk from a counterparty perspective. Third, the structuring flexibility for us here, just given the regulatory regime, is quite limited. So when I do a transaction in, let's say, even the Middle East or Australia, I can do penny warrants, I can do convertibles in listed companies, I can do exits which are not necessarily linked to FMV. You can do a lot of structuring, which today is actually very, very restricted in India. And none of this is to say that India should be avoided. Like, these are all growing pains of a market that is evolving. And as the market evolves and as the regulation evolves, there will be a much, much higher global allocation from large global organizations such as us. The IBC has unquestionably transformed recoveries. So when I think of a period when we did private credit before IBC and now, it's a world of difference, because now when you sit across the table on the promoter, he knows there is a real risk that if things go wrong, they will lose control of the business and the institution will be able to act, and there is a real viable path. Having said that, there are challenges and improvements to be done in the code, and which the government is progressively working on. And I always compare this to an analogy or a simile to an airline. So when I look at the IBC and I think of an airline, I was promised that I would arrive in 300 days. In reality, I arrive in 700 days. I was promised a non-stop flight, but sometimes I end up having 2 stopovers which are not scheduled on my original flight plan, and there's a gate change. And then I arrive occasionally when some luggage missing. So the good news is the IBC gets you there. You will get from point A to point B, but the journey may be having a little more adventure than you signed up for. The government's working on it, and I think it's a really encouraging development, and as the market evolves and as more and more case laws emerge, there will be a much clearer path for people to get through enforcement. I would conclude by saying markets and opportunities of this scale come very rarely in an investor's career. Like, how many times do we sit in a room and say that this is a segment which I think is going to triple or quadruple during the course of my investing career? It's very, very rare. So this is a phenomenal opportunity for everybody in this segment. Having said that, the firms that will succeed over the next decade will provide solutions as much as they will provide capital. They will underwrite promoters as much as they underwrite balance sheets. And they will recognize that flexibility and structuring is a much higher competitive advantage than simply having cost of capital. So for us at Brookfield, we do believe this is a sector which is going to see a multi-decade growth from here, and it's a very, very exciting space to be in. That's it from my side. I want to thank IVCA and the whole team for setting this forum up for us, for engaging, and I look forward to the rest of the sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, sir.